Hi everyone, today we're going to be exploring chapter 2 of Layered Existentialism, which is the constraints of human nature and why we cannot experience life without distortions. For those that are new, welcome. To those that are repeat viewers, welcome back. For those that are new to my videos, typically what I've been doing is reading my writing with commentary, if it is useful. So with that being said, before we even get started today, I want us to think about, specifically with this chapter, I want us to think about a time that we've had that we were having a conversation with perhaps whomever it is, and no matter what we said to them to get this idea through to them, they could not understand. Perhaps we thought to ourselves, maybe it's the way that we're communicating to them, but why can't they see things my way? Why don't they understand this? Perhaps emotion isn't there, perhaps it's a communication style, articulation, perhaps it's even a language barrier. Language barrier is a little bit more understandable, but I want us to kind of keep that in the back of our mind. And if there has been a situation where someone's explaining something to you or us, but you, if you also could not understand the weight of what they were saying to you, based off of the emotions that they were showing off to what they were telling you. With that being said, let's get started. Growing up, I had a friend whose sister was considered her polar opposite. Even to this day, they both lead very different lives and both describe their childhood very differently. We all hold our own vision of what our life is and the narrative that follows. We carry our own influences and narratives into someone's world, whether it be accurate or not. However, we cannot experience life without distortions. Before we explore this constraints in further depth and detail, we should acknowledge something essential. Humans cannot experience pure reality. We experience a filtered version of it. Those filters are not optional, they are built into our biology and psychology. Meanwhile, having constraints do not diminish the human experience, they define it. Without understanding these constraints, people blame themselves for patterns they never chose or judge others for limitations they never designed. This chapter names the boundaries within which all human experience unfolds. I personally thought that it was important to add an agency and discipline clause. Perhaps it would be very easy for us to be like, well, if these are all the constraints about human nature, then why continue and why should we go on? These are some of the agency and the discipline clause is to discuss just a little bit further about that. So these constraints do not eliminate agency or discipline. The constraints define the conditions under which agency and discipline operates. So while we don't get to choose our biology or early conditioning or the cultural system that we were born into, we do have the capacity to respond. Agency and discipline does not mean freedom from constraint. It just means that we can take action within the constraints. Discipline in this framework is not a force or self-punishment. It is the repeated practice of awareness, regulation, and interruption that is applied over time. The purpose of naming these constraints is orientation. Once the boundaries are visible, movement becomes possible. I would like for us to just briefly recap the 4 layers of self, the framework. For more depth, please feel free to visit my Substack page, where all my writings lives. It's the main platform of where my writing lives for more in-depth on the 4 layers of self framework. But to briefly review, layer 1, there are 4 layers. Layer 1 is autopilot, and this is the unconscious default mode of habits, routines, and conditioned responses from childhood and culture, and it saves energy but keeps us repeating patterns without questions. Layer 2 is the nervous system or biology. This instinctive layer is driven by physiology, emotions, and survival wiring. It reacts to threats, real or perceived, before thought, shaping how life feels, but often misfiring in modern contexts. Layer 3 is meaning making, which is our narrative self, where we construct narratives from emotions, memories, and biases to create coherence. It provides purpose but can distort truth through subjectivity. Layer 4 is deliberate self-awareness, the rare, intentional layer of reflection and choice. It allows us to observe and interrupt lower layers, fostering growth when the condition allows. These layers aren't a strict hierarchy. We move between them fluidly. And now, let's dive into the constraints. Constraint 1. I feel like I've been saying this for the past few episodes, but biology is a foundation and not a destiny. Biology is often mistaken for destiny, but it functions as a foundation. Our body sets the parameters of our experience, and this includes our nervous system, sensory thresholds, inherited temperament, biological sensitivity, stress resilience baseline, and neurochemistry. These shape what life feels like to us. Biology reacts before we think, interprets before we choose, and decides before we rationalize. Emotion arises before interpretation and often distort experiences before conscious awareness. Emotions are chemically driven, context sensitive, often based on incomplete data, shaped by early attachment, amplified by nervous system dysregulation, and influenced by shame, guilt, insecurity, and ego. Emotional distortion is not a malfunction. It is part of being human, and we do not get to opt out of biology. As mentioned in prior chapters, prior chapters in previous videos, it is possible to have dualities in life, and such will be mentioned. In regards to constraint 1, the duality is as follows. The pros. The biology very much keeps us alive, but this distortion is that it often misreads modern life as a threat. And many assume the nervous system exists to protect us, which is true, however, it is incomplete. Our nervous system exists to detect threat, and it is biased towards false positives. This simply means that our nervous system can alert us even when nothing is wrong, perceive slights, interprets ambiguity as danger, misreads tone, and reacts to uncertainty as threat. Our biology tries to save us from things that were never dangerous to begin with. It was not designed for social media, constant comparison, overstimulation, ambiguous social cues, chronic stress, existential choices, and mass information, which I'm going to overgeneralize and say that many of us are probably floating in that boat unless we are actively trying not to be. This explains much of modern social anxiety, rejection sensitivity, overthinking, panicking, freezing under pressure, and emotional shutdown. But the key truth remains. Biology sets a default with awareness to modulate, but not to replace. We cannot think our way out of our nervous system, but we can learn to navigate it. Constraint 2. Autopilot dominates unless interrupted. Much of human life is lived unconsciously through autopilot, which is layer 1. Autopilot repeats old patterns, follows habit loops, maintains social conditioning, reacts to triggers automatically, seeks familiarity, avoids novelty, and preserves our self-story, which is our narrative layer for coherence. This is not a flaw, but it's efficient. The benefits is that it saves energy, however, the distortion is that we get blinded to our own patterns. Most humans repeat their scripts from childhood, find partners who match familiarity, including old wounds, reacting with familiar emotions, and avoid frequently experiences that challenges identity. Not because they chose wrongly or incorrectly, but because autopilot doesn't question anything until it gets interrupted. Constraint 3. Meaning making is unreliable. Humans are a meaning making machine, which is layer 3. We each hold narratives that merge our experiences with the stories of others. However, it is built on emotions, memory distortion, cultural bias, personal bias, trauma, incomplete information, and ego protection. Meaning can feel true without being accurate. How many of us have had that one friend or several friends that have been in questionable relationships? It felt true to them, but everyone else around them just knew exactly where this relationship is headed or might be heading. Another example is when there is silence. Silence seems like something that many of us don't enjoy these days, but there is so much benefit with silence. But sometimes when there is silence, especially if one is not used to it, it can be interpreted as rejection or someone else's stress as a personal failure. Even a breakup can be interpreted to being unworthy, or childhood events as definitive truths. Meaning making gives us a coherent story, but coherence is not necessarily accurate. The pros of meaning making is that it provides stability, yet it can deceive us. We often believe that memory is a stored file, though it is not. Memory is reconstructed each time it is accessed, and this means that details can shift, emotions can rewrite events, new knowledge edits old memories, so for example, additional context information was provided aftermath. Other people's narratives of the event influences us, and our current state can color the past experience differently. Two people can remember the same moment, be in the same place, at the same time, and tell completely different stories, and both can feel true. This does not mean that one is lying. It means that memory is fluid and not fixed. This constraint becomes foundational for understanding meaning making and trauma. We cannot live without meaning, but meaning is rarely objective. Constraint 4. Self-awareness is rare and fragile. As mentioned earlier, most humans go through life on autopilot, as deliberate self-awareness, which is layer 4, is not the default human state. Awareness collapses under stress, ego threat, fatigue, overwhelm, emotional pain, cognitive dissonance, and identity disruption. Awareness is not stable. It flickers like a flame. It comes and goes. And most people live in layers 1 and 2, visits layer 3, and touch layer 4 only when conditions are safe. This is a universal limitation and not a personal failing. Man, that coffee is super cold. Constraint 5. Humans are adaptive, not inherently good or evil. While it may be easier to interpret life or others as good versus bad or good versus evil, layered existentialism removes moral judgment from biology. It approaches humans as adaptive rather than inherent good versus evil. Adaptation explains behavior without turning harm into virtue. Judgment is not a flaw in human nature, it is an adaptive function. Awareness does not eliminate judgment but can change how tightly we hold it. Explanation does not eliminate responsibility, but it does remove the illusion of moral simplicity. Something further that I would like to elaborate on this constraint as well is, with this constraint, perhaps some people would say, well, if there's no such thing as good and bad or good versus evil, then I'm just going to go for it. I did want to mention that, especially in society where laws are in place and harming people is frowned upon and things in regards to social order, just because there is this constraint does not mean that the person is not held responsible. It is our responsibility to hopefully hold goodness and to do well towards other people, for ourselves and for other people. So if we, for some reason, choose to harm, do know that the responsibility is to accept that there are consequences to those type of behaviors. Moving on. Our behavior is shaped by survival pressures, environment, culture, trauma, incentives, fear, belonging, resources, and meaning structures, which can explain altruism, cruelty, empathy, violence, compassion, and greed. Not as absolutes, but as context-driven adaptations. Humans seek comfort, belonging, power, and certainty. In benevolent environments, these drives appear as kindness, and in hostile environments, they appear as aggression. Human nature is not fixed, it is conditional. Constraint 6. Culture shapes perceptions more than we realize. The influence of culture is invisible until we encounter another one. Culture informs what is considered normal, moral, shameful, celebrated, emotions that are allowed, identities that are acceptable, and stories that we tell about ourselves. It installs dialogue in layer 1, shapes fear responses in layer 2, defines meaning in layer 3, and places boundaries on layer 4. Culture is not optional. We swim in it like fish in water. Constraint 7. The universe is indifferent. The universe is very much indifferent to how humans choose to live their life as individual and as collectives. We typically seek justice, fairness, purpose, destiny, and cosmic meaning, but the universe offers entropy, randomness, physics, time, and decay. This is not supposed to be nihilism, but liberation. If the universe is indifferent, then we are free to create meaning instead of waiting to find it. Still, the tension remains that the awareness of cosmic indifference can feel like existential dread or existential permission, which both belongs to layer 3 and 4. Constraint 8. Truth is both essential and impossible to access fully. We all want the truth, but it is impossible to access it fully due to perception, memory, emotion bias, biology, culture, and different narration. Truth exists, but humans only access versions of it. Partial access to truth requires humility, not indifference. It is not a fixed endpoint, but a process shaped by context, correction, and time. And this is the paradox. We seek truth, but we live in interpretation. Constraint 9. Not everyone has equal access to growth. People differ based on nervous system sensitivity, trauma burden, environment, safety, resources, education, supportive relationships, mental health, cultural pressure, opportunity, and existential exposure. Growth is not just willpower, it is access, capacity, and context. And why these constraints matter is that these boundaries clarify human behavior, suffering, relationships, identity, and the instability of meaning. These constraints do not diminish humanity, they make us understandable. Without these truths, any philosophy becomes idealistic. And with them, our philosophy becomes grounded, realistic, and honest. And for my next video, we're going to explore how the body and pattern shapes the human life, which it's called biology, emotions, and autopilot. My work on it is actually out already on Substack, the writing version of it. So please feel free to go ahead and read it if you choose to do so. As we further talk about this, a lot of this can be very discomforting because perhaps it provides friction and rubs against the narratives that we produce to ourselves to make our life a little bit more stable. So if this does feel very discomforting, it's very unstabilizing or destabilizing, I do appreciate it if you sit with it. Because oftentimes that is where awareness begins. And if it is too much, feel free to turn this off and then revisit whenever you feel a little bit more stable. Again, if you choose to do so. But as always, feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions, if you want to talk about the meaning of life or anything of that sort. At the fourth layer with 2 R's at gmail.com. I'm sure it's going to be in the description box where my direct contact information is, or feel free to comment. With that being said, I do appreciate you for being here so very much. And until next time, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.